Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name's Jane Hewitt and I'm the Capability Building Coordinator at Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand. Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand are part of the Info Exchange Group, a not-for-profit social enterprise that tackles the biggest social challenges through the smart and creative use of technology. And you can check out our calendar of webinars, webcons, bootcamps on both of the Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand websites. Before we begin today, I'll just start with a bit of housekeeping. All lines are muted, so if you have any technical issues, please type them into questions box on your GoToWebinar panel, and I should be able to assist. If you're on a Wi-Fi connection and have multiple programs open, please could you just close any programs you're not using to get the best possible quality of video. Please note this webinar is being recorded and you'll be sent a link to the slides and the recording along with a survey at the end of today. And before we start, I'd just like to remind everybody that there's a short survey that pops up at the end of the webinar, and we'd really appreciate any feedback. So welcome today to the webinar Hiring for Potential with Nishal Mistry. And that's all from me. I will pass over to Nishal to get things started.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you everyone for making the time this morning to join us for this webinar. I am just going to bring up my screen. And yeah, this morning we're going to talk about hiring for potential and in essence, really just going beyond the resume. I myself had the good fortune of attending a webinar this past week, and it was hosted by JobAdder, which is a recruitment or an applicant tracking system. And the keynote speaker at that webinar was a recruitment industry legend and somewhat of an icon called Greg Savage. And what Greg was really talking about in that presentation was the trends across the recruitment industry over the past 15 months. And obviously, I think everyone knows that the job market has been through some significant change in the past couple of years. And, it comes probably as no surprise that, the indications from Greg is that, hiring managers just really need to change the way that they're approaching recruitment. When he said that, what he was kind of leaning towards was that, in the market at the moment, there's a shortage of candidates. There's certainly a shortage of qualified candidates for roles, and the speed at which hiring managers act and the speed at which they take candidates through their traditional recruitment process needs to change and needs to be evaluated. And so Greg pointed out and had some really interesting statistics that he referenced during his presentation, and two in particular stood out to me. So he looked back at a Q2 of 2020, and what he said was across the recruitment industry, on average, agencies were posting 25 new jobs per quarter. So if you look back at Q2 last year, there were 25 new jobs posted by each agency on average. And what he found and what they found through their research is that on average, each job attracted 55 applicants. So you've got 25 new jobs per quarter and you've got 55 applicants per job. If we fast forward to Q2 of this year, what we have now is an increase. So number of jobs being posted per agency has jumped to 55 new jobs per quarter. What has gone and what the trend has been is in terms of number of applicants against those jobs, that's dropped significantly. So last year where we were averaging 55 applicants per new job, we're now averaging just under 20. So the average is 18 applicants per job. So I think it's clear to see that, the way we went about it previously and the processes and the steps we followed, the time frame that we had, the traditional shortlisting mechanisms that we had in place probably need to be revisited. The market's changed, and I think, this concept of finding the ideal candidate or even presenting hiring managers with, 3 best candidates is up for grabs. I think there's a lot of candidates who are being made offers and being made counter offers. It's very much a candidate market right now. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, different approaches when assessing candidates, particularly in light of the current situation. So here we're going to spend some time talking about hiring for potential, which for us, is defined as the ability to identify and to assess candidates against a set of soft skills. So today we're going to talk about what soft skills are, so what makes up soft skills, how they compare to hard skills, and traditionally how we go about assessing candidates. We're going to identify, which soft skills are probably most in demand, and we're going to workshop and work through kind of how we assess candidates against these soft skills. We're going to give some practical tips about, how we can create soft skill assessments. I think we also, will look at the fact that for a lot of hiring managers and for a lot of recruitment teams, historically, there was the ability to meet with candidates in person. There's the ability to, whether we initially screened them on the phone, but often there was at least one face-to-face meeting. And a lot of the, rapport building you can still do over the phone today. But I think a lot of hiring managers and a lot of recruiters in particular had the ability to assess some soft skills of candidates, and they did this by assessing them in person. So, I think when we look at current trends, and to be honest with you, I don't think it's likely that we're going to be having a lot of face-to-face interaction with candidates in the short term, at least not until, probably I'd say early to mid next year. What are the alternatives in how we can go about assessing soft skills? So we'll address why they're important, how to assess them, and then we'll go through some practical examples for you to consider. So what are soft skills? Soft skills to me are probably a combination of things. So it's a combination of people skills, social skills, your communication skills, your character, your personality traits, definitely your attitude, your social intelligence, and your emotional intelligence. So your EQ, or emotional intelligence IQ, as they reference it. So I think these enable employees to navigate typically their working environments. They also give us some insights as to how well suited these people or these potential employees are to working with others. So their suitability for team-based environments, and then also their ability to perform the role and to achieve the goals and targets that you set out for them. And I think through this process, what we want to identify, what we want to acknowledge is that soft skills have always existed in job descriptions. They've always been requirements for organizations. However, I think when you look at the way you traditionally assess candidates, a lot of your time and a lot of your effort is spent on assessing hard skills. By no doubt, for a lot of organizations, those are the priorities. Can this person show up and can they do the job? And so, a lot of that was very much based at looking at hard skills. And hard skills are typically things that we learn on the job. They can be things like qualifications. They can be things like education. But a lot of hard skills these days, relate to skills that we've picked up by doing similar tasks in either previous jobs or for similar organizations. So today we're going to talk about, how we can incorporate soft skills into this process. Why we think soft skills are important now. We just think there's a shift in terms of how organizations will staff moving, into present day and probably into the future. I think more sort of effort and more time will be spent on understanding, if employees have the right skills and the right attitudes to complement an organization. We also acknowledge that organizations are changing. So, we've had the digital transformation, which is something that every sort of organization has grappled with over the past 5 years. And it's kind of been that transition from paper-based or manual process into digital alternatives. And through that process, I think there's been a lot of cross-skill and cross-skill development of staff within existing organizations. So I think it's widely acknowledged across the HR profession that soft skills are very important. I think today the idea is that considering we have a shortage of talent in the recruitment context, we need to get people into organizations that we can develop. And so, how can we go about assessing that? And here, this is where we think soft skills have an important part to play. when we look into the future and when we consider the future of work, our research tells us that reskilling is a key component for the future of work. So we've got our existing workforce, we've got all of these external factors that are going to change the way that we do business. So for a lot of HR teams and for a lot of leadership teams, they've identified that a lot of roles that exist today and a lot of jobs and tasks that exist today might not exist in the same way in the future. And so what this presents with is an opportunity to reskill your existing workforce, to be suitable to meet the demands of the changing workplace. So here our research has identified that 50% of all employees will need to be reskilled in one way or another, within the next 3 to 4 years. And we also identify that the majority of employees now expect to learn new skills when they join an organization. Next up, we look at internal mobility. So what is internal mobility, and what does it mean? Internal mobility is a term that's used to describe movement, or movement opportunities for your employees within your organization. There's often, two types of internal mobility. There's vertical mobility, so that's the ability for employees to access opportunities to grow up the organization. So that's potentially, to go up into a new job level. And there's also horizontal internal mobility. So this is where people can move from existing jobs or roles into similar ones at a similar job level. And what we're anticipating and what we're seeing in the market is that 1 in 5 employees will experience these internal mobility opportunities. A lot of internal mobility in an organization will be dependent on the organization's investment in learning and development. So this ability to upskill, to cross-skill existing employees, to give them these opportunities to take on new roles within the existing organization. Next up, it's something that I think is happening today. So virtual recruitment is something that I believe is quite common in the market today. As we've said in the past, the ability to meet with potential candidates face to face, the ability to build that rapport, the ability to have people come in for assessment days, that's disappeared, and we're less likely to see that return in what it was, probably 2 years ago in the near future. So we think, a lot of recruitment now will be done virtually, and looking forward, I'd say probably, maybe not the next 12 months, but at least for the next 6 months, I think that's here to stay. And so for a lot of recruitment teams and for a lot of businesses, they've invested in technology to assist them with this. I think technology is wonderful in sort of adding some efficiency and streamlining process, but there's a lot of stuff that's lost through this process. And in particular, I think there's that ability in the past when you met with people face to face was to build that rapport, to build that connection, and to assess those people. You could pick up verbal cues or non-verbal cues rather around behavior and around the way people explain their past experience or job history, and how they explain their ability to meet requirements of current roles. There was just that ability to, I think you speak to a lot of hiring managers, they talk about gut feel. I met that person, we got along really well, we built rapport, it was easy to do, and I have a good feeling about them. When you talk to managers about how they've assessed, things like attitude, past experience, communication skills, those types of things, a lot of it and a lot of those insights they would typically get through a face-to-face meeting. So if we acknowledge that face-to-face meetings are probably, going to be difficult to accomplish in the short term, there's only so much we can do over Zoom, Teams, GoToMeeting. I think we're going to have to look at virtual recruiting and what we gain from virtual recruiting, but also acknowledge what we lose through that process. Now, as part of this process, a lot of recruitment teams have spoken about a reduction in budgets. So, moving forward, they need to be a little more savvy about how they assess candidates and typically where they spend their time. So the idea is they're going to be asked to do more and they're going to be given less resources to achieve that. So how do they go about it? We also acknowledge with the recruitment team and for the changes that we're expecting in the workforce, remote work or hybrid work is going to be something that's just going to be a commonplace for employees and for employers. I think this notion that everybody shall return to the office and return to work is lost. I went to a presentation by the team at Atlassian last week, and they have a work futurist, and he was talking about this whole concept of coming back to work, and he's the first one to point out that employees haven't stopped working because of a pandemic. They just don't go to an office to do the work. So the idea that remote work or at least hybrid working where you have some time at the office and some time away from the office is definitely something that's going to be here to stay. I actually think from a candidate perspective, when candidates assess potential roles and assess potential employers, this is going to be a key consideration for them. So this flexibility, this ability to have a bit of both, so the ability to come into an office when needed, but also this ability to work remotely is going to factor significantly in their decisions about employment opportunities. Next, we'll have a look at some of the soft skills that we believe are in demand at the moment. So these are some of the commonly identified soft skills that we view today. We commonly see these across organizations that we work with. And, I think in the current circumstances, a couple of these stand out. So for me, I think the main one right now is around resilience. I mean, these are challenging times for everyone. And so I think, where in the past somebody's resilience has been less of a priority, I think for a lot of organizations, I mean, when you consider that the entire recruitment process these days could be something that's delivered virtually, where you don't actually meet anyone from the organization. A lot of onboarding these days are done, virtually as well. So it's a digital experience, but there's no ability to connect with anybody in the organization. I think resilience is probably one of the key soft skills that people are looking for today. And then, obviously things like adaptivity, having a growth mindset, and then there's some of your traditional ones, which are really speaking to things like problem solving, teamwork, and lifelong learning. I think these are key to that ability or to identify those employees with potential for reskilling or upskilling or taking on tasks for the future. So jobs that don't necessarily exist today, but might exist in the next 3 to 4 years. So, how do we identify soft skills during the recruitment process? And when we identify them, how can we choose which soft skills to prioritize, when we're assessing candidates for different roles? So when it comes to choosing soft skills, there's a whole list of soft skills, which I think are important, but how do you prioritize? So our advice on this is, if there's 20 soft skills that you've identified that could apply to a range of roles in your organization, it's not practical, we don't believe, to assess somebody against all of that. So our recommendation is, the best way to go about this is probably to prioritize. So let's identify soft skills that are important to us. Then against each role, let's prioritize. So let's keep the list to probably 3 or 4. So say, look, we've got 20 soft skills that we've identified in the past as being pertinent in the organization. These will speak to someone who would be a successful employee. Instead of trying to assess every potential candidate against all 20 of these, let's break it down. So let's simplify it. Let's identify the top 3 or the top 4. Let's set out, to then assess candidates against these criteria. And then potentially as they progress through the recruitment process, we can revisit some of the other soft skills that are important to the role. So our advice and our kind of hints around doing this, it often helps to do this in a group setting. If you think about the recruitment process, you often have someone from HR or the recruitment team who works with a hiring manager, and together, they tend to do things like a job description. They'll craft a job ad and a go-to-market, and the hiring manager will provide some criteria about what they're looking for. So, when it comes to identifying soft skills, I think it should be a group exercise as well. So I think it'd be good to engage with different stakeholders. Obviously, having some representation from a HR perspective, having some representation from hiring managers or from the operation side of the organization is typically a good mix of people. And how we would go about doing this is, as we say, we list the skills that are needed against a position. We add, skills based on the company's cultures and values. Then what we do is that's kind of our long list, right? And so what we want to do from there is we want to narrow the list to the bare essentials. So here, like we say, the hint that we provide is kind of saying, now imagine if these 20 sort of skills or sort of soft skills that we've identified, if this is our long list, we now have to narrow that down. And the kind of advice we provide on this and the guidance is, imagine if you just had 24 hours to recruit. So, let's prioritize. Let's get a list of 3 or 4 that we identify as being the top sort of cultural cues or values. Let's assess people against those. And so in step 4, we want to, again, have the ability to go through and assess people against these particular skills. So how are we going to do that? How can we do it in a consistent way? Well, we set up a standard set of questions that we want to ask against each set of or each soft skill that we've identified. So for example, what makes you a independent worker? And we'll give you some other examples around this. And then, what we've done is we want to have some consistency. So we together as a group, whether it's HR and the hiring manager, we work together to define what these soft skills mean to the organization. And then also, how we as a business would assess somebody against them. So if we looked at a practical example, so here I've got an example of a call center consultant. We've identified, from a role perspective, what's required. So, somebody that's technologically adept, someone who can work shift hours, someone who has strong verbal communication skills, somebody who has exceptional customer service skills, somebody who works well under pressure. So this might look familiar to you. It's, typically how the requirements for a job would be articulated. So we've got some hard skills and we've got a combination of eligibility. So, am I eligible to work shift hours? So can I work weekends, for example? And then we have some soft skills that we've identified. And then if we want to incorporate some company values, so in our company values, things we value are a growth mindset, or we value people who are able to contribute in a team environment. So, you have to be strong for teamwork, and just people who are flexible. And so through this process, what we can go through is we can go through and we can color code these and kind of say, okay, well, here I've identified 4 different types of soft skills. So one being customer focus, one being communication, one being resilience, and one being teamwork. And so again, distilling a job description or job requirements, we have the ability to then identify soft skills that are priorities for this, and then we can go through the process of assessing somebody against these soft skills. So, how we typically would do this and how we would recommend you go about creating or assessing somebody against your defined set of soft skills is by creating what we call an interview rubrics. So if you've never used an interview rubrics before, just imagine it's really simple and straightforward. It's just a methodology that recruiters use, right, and hiring managers to consistently ask candidates the same series of questions. So if you imagine we were interviewing 20 people and we wanted to create an interview rubrics. Now, in the last slide, we kind of identified 4 soft skills that we wanted to assess. Maybe against each soft skill, we want to ask 2 questions. Right? So 2 questions per each one. That's 8 questions in total. Then what we want to do as a group is we want to define what we consider to be generally accepted good responses. So if I'm trying to measure someone against teamwork, what's a good response for teamwork? And so here, once we have consistency in questioning, we want to create consistency in scoring. And this enables us to give everybody the same opportunity, right, to put their best foot forward, but also it gives us a level playing field when it comes to assessing soft skills. Now, there's two ways of creating an interview rubrics. There's some amazing technology out there that will assist you with doing that. There's also, really today, if you wanted to set up a rubrics, you could do it quite manually. A spreadsheet would work just as well. So, what we would do is we would define our questions, we would define our scoring or marking criteria, and then we would go through the process of interviewing and connecting with candidates and going through this process. Obviously, here what we've tried to do is kind of talk about the pros and cons of each. The manual mechanism is obviously person dependent, and when you have a person go through the process of collecting this type of data, obviously there's a limitation on just the scalability of how many candidates we can reach out to. Whereas, if we have the ability to use digital alternatives, there's the ability to reach out to as many candidates, in a much faster and more scalable way through the process. Both come with pros and cons, and obviously, those are identified for you. For me, I think, as a starting point, if you're not doing a soft skills assessment today, I think step one would be to incorporate a soft skills assessment. Step two would be making sure that you're consistent in how you're approaching candidates about it. So, what we find is in the past, depending on who the hiring manager is, a candidate might receive a very different candidate experience between one interview and another. It's human nature as well. If you build rapport with someone, you get along with them, it's often easier to kind of make these assessments than if you've got someone that you struggle with. So here with the machine-based environment, there is the ability to kind of move away from that. And so, we can create user experience frameworks where we punch out the same set of questions, we pre-build our sort of criteria for marking and scoring, and there's the ability, to do that. It's just less personalized, not a human being on the other side, but there's a machine on the other side making this assessment for us. So next up, we thought we would jump into some practical sort of examples of soft skills. So different soft skills that exist. What do they mean? How do we go about assessing candidates against these soft skills? So what are some examples of questions that we could potentially ask? And then what does it mean? So what do these soft skills actually mean in the context of recruiting someone? So let's have a look. So here what we've done is we've broken it down. So first up, we'll look at adaptivity and business acumen. So what is adaptivity? So for us, adaptivity is the ability to adapt to new environments and remain flexible in order to meet your goals. So how would we recommend you assess somebody against adaptivity? So here an example for a question would be, tell us about one of your biggest work challenges in the past, and what did you learn through that process? So what does this tell us about that candidate, right? So the way the candidate responds to a large challenge will make adaptive traits evident. So again, through this process, we've identified a soft skill that's important to us. We've identified a question that we would want to ask to probe a candidate against this particular criteria. And then, what insight does that drive for us? So as you go through this, if we look at a different example, if we looked at business acumen, so what is business acumen defined as for us? Well, here it's a deep and applied understanding of how a business operates and achieves its goals. So, being commercially minded. What's an example of how we would assess a candidate against this? So you're about to start planning a big project. How would you start the process? It's going to give us some insights as to the way the candidate starts a big project, and it's also going to provide some insight into their understanding of how a business operates. This is going to speak to their past experience, how they process information, how they plan, how they set themselves up whenever they take on a new project. So again, two examples of soft skills, what they're defined as, and again, how we would go and question candidates about their past experience to gain some insight into their suitability. Next up, we've got customer focus, a growth mindset, and humility. Again, very similar structure. So let's have a look. So when it comes to customer focus, what's that defined as for us? So it's the ability to put oneself in the customer's shoes and then to provide a great experience. I think for a lot of organizations, certainly for our organization, customer focus is a huge part for almost every role we have in the organization. So we're a small organization, there's 25 of us, and I would say half the organization is probably an engineering background, not a lot of direct customer focus, and the other half of the organization is probably more commercial focused and very, very much priorities for us and skills that we look for is an attitude towards customer focus. So if you're applying for a job at Curious Thing, for example, typically one of the questions you'd get asked in the recruitment process is, have you ever gone above and beyond for a customer? And can you tell us what happened in the past? And what this does for us from a recruitment perspective is it just gives us some insight into, what does above and beyond mean to this candidate? And it also, very much highlights their attitude towards customer service for us. So what does it mean, when somebody goes above and beyond for a client? And again, being a small organization, this is key for us because we're a very customer-centric organization. Considering that employees and employers and the focus will very much shift on things like reskilling the workforce and also internal mobility in the short term, I think one of the most important sort of attributes I look for, particularly when I recruit junior roles, particularly graduate roles. There's two of them. So one is a growth mindset, and the other one is referred to as lifelong learning. So and the reason I do this is we'll go through these examples and I kind of highlight why they're important to me. So growth mindset is the desire to continue to grow and expand one's comfort zone. So this is school of thought. There's two types of mindsets that typically exist. There's a growth mindset and there's what they refer to as a fixed mindset. And there's a variety of assessment tools in the market that help you assess somebody against both a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And there's also, a lot of sort of literature and support and training and consulting and advisory services that help organizations change that mindset. So help you, if somebody's got a fixed mindset, help you kind of move them along and change and change their behaviors and change their attitudes into more of a growth mindset. So an example of how we would assess somebody is tell us about a time when you stepped outside of your comfort zone. How did you approach the situation? And what this reveals to us is whether the candidate actively seeks opportunities to get out of their comfort zone and the way they do that. Right? It's very important for us. Again, like we say, if we consider how the workplace is changing and how fast that change is happening, we want to understand, in terms of the staff, or in terms of the skill sets and attitudes that we have within the workforce, how suitable are those employees, our existing employees, how suitable are they to taking on new challenges as they present themselves within the organization? So growth mindset's a key one for me. Another one that I look for, and I'll tell you this, I kind of, I preference lifelong learning to motivation. I think motivation is important. I typically historically have led sales teams and sales capabilities. So, I think motivation is there. One that I really love is lifelong learning. So the ability to, the ability and willingness to continue to learn new knowledge and new skills. I think, the wonderful thing about working in technology is that you're guaranteed that no 2 days are the same, and, things change incredibly quickly. So how do we typically go along or go about assessing somebody for lifelong learning? An example question would be, have you ever turned a failure into a learning opportunity, and what happened? So, if a candidate is able to assess and learn from any of their past failures, chances are, right, they value lifelong learning. So again, from a sales perspective, yes, resilience is important. It's difficult, particularly, if things are not going your way, but also through this process, adaptivity, growth mindset, lifelong learning, those are also key attributes that we identify, at least that, I prioritize when looking for potential new employees. So again here, from a resilience perspective, here it's the ability to cope with challenges like stress and high pressure. So again, example questions would be, have you ever worked in a project or a task that required multiple attempts? Can you tell us about it? And again, from a coaching perspective or from an assessment perspective, we really just want to understand, when things aren't going your way, when you're faced with challenges, how do you react to these situations? So next up, what we wanted to do is just kind of touch on, how we've, and at Curious Thing, assisted organizations with this particular conundrum, and how we've incorporated soft skill assessments into recruitment processes. So we work with some large and some very small organizations. And what we're able to do is, if you consider the manual sort of interview rubrics to the automated one, Curious Thing provides technology to support and to help organizations create kind of that interview rubrics or those soft skill assessments. Very much what we look at doing is creating, this ability to engage with a candidate. So we ask an open-ended set of questions. Typically these questions are to support the assessment of soft skills. So all of those soft skills that we identified, we create a questioning set. We ask these questions to candidates, and then based on their responses, we score or we mark them in a consistent manner. So here we did some work with an organization called Viventus. Viventus screen roughly between 50,000 and 60,000 candidates per year. And the two stats that jumped out to us the most, to me, the most interesting one was the second one, where interview attendance had grown 100% year on year by using Curious Thing. So the Curious Thing approach is really different to your traditional interviewing approach. So here, what we do is we enable candidates to access an on-demand service. So instead of you having to be available at 10:15 for 15 minutes to talk to a recruiter or a hiring manager, you can take your assessment whenever you want. So it's available to you 24 hours, 7 days a week. So identifying that it's a candidate short market and identifying the challenges with traditional recruitment and the volumes that they're dealing with, our approach is to say, why don't we shift it? Why don't we say to candidates, we think you're the right person for us, you have the right traits for us. What we want to do is we want to interview you at your convenience. So if you're in a current role at the moment and office hours aren't suitable, that's fine. Take this interview at night. So, you wait until it's the right time for you, and then you have the ability to access this assessment. And then the other thing that we were very, very proud of was the ability to convert candidates. So two things for us: every applicant got an interview with Viventus, whereas in the past they would shortlist and only the shortlist got interviews. So 95% of people who applied for the job were unsuccessful. There was no engagement from the organization. You just received an email once the role was filled saying you were unsuccessful. Here, what we had was we were able to engage with more candidates. So everybody who applied, granted that they were eligible, got an interview. Based on that assessment, they were given feedback about where their strengths were, where potential development needs were, so they got something out of the process, and that led to a significantly higher conversion rate for the Viventus organization. So for us at Curious Thing, we've tried to simplify and to assist organizations with this process of assessment. We create, just nice and easy, an assessment per role. Here we identify, like we said, the top 3 or 4 behavioral attributes that are important. We invite candidates along, and it's really easy. It's literally an email address or a mobile phone number is sufficient. You get an email or a text message with your details. You can access it 24/7. You dial a toll-free number, and a typical 3 to 4 behavioral assessment interview takes roughly 10 minutes to complete. And then through that process, we have a deep sort of analysis into a couple of things. We score you against behavioral traits. So things like motivation, things like lifelong learning, things like resilience. We also provide some personality and behavioral indicators. And those for those customers who have customer service roles or engagements with external organizations as part of their service delivery. There's also the ability to provide English language proficiency. Our entire assessment is done verbally, and so through this process, we have built in the IELTS framework, so the International English Language Testing Standard, and we're able to assess candidates against that framework. Really simple, like we said, email invitation or text message. It's an on-demand service, it's a toll-free number, and then there's the ability to provide feedback to candidates through the process. A little bit about us as an organization. So, we're an organization that's 3 years old. We've really just spent our time focusing on building artificial intelligence and using artificial intelligence as the backbone of what we do. But actually, our main part of our business is around conversational AI. So creating conversations between organizations and candidates or customers, or whatever it is, and then through that process, we either share information or we discover information. And here in the process of working with candidates or potential future employees, it is very, very much that ability to share information. So it could be sharing information about the recruitment process, or it's typically around discovering information around things like behavioral traits, personality traits, and all of the things that are pertinent to making sound recruitment decisions. So for me, that's the end of my presentation. What I thought we'd do is leave some time for some questions. So Jane, if there are any questions, if there's any thoughts, I'm happy to go through those now.
Lovely, thank you very much. No, don't think we have any questions at the moment. But thank you, that was a great presentation. If anybody does have any questions, please do get them in. And if anybody thinks of anything in the next few days, please reach out and then we can send your questions. Nope, just somebody saying hello. Yeah, but please do get in touch. I'll be sending along the slides and the recording towards the end of today, and I'll put in all the contact details for Nishal. And if anybody does think of anything that they'd like to ask, then please do reach out to us. So thanks very much, Nishal. And thanks everybody for joining us today. And keep an eye on your inbox and please do fill in the survey. Thanks very much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Jane. Bye, everyone.
Cheers. Bye-bye.